All right, everybody, we are going to go ahead and cover our nervous system chapter. Let me go ahead and turn off these captions just so it doesn't cover anything up. YouTube will caption it for me. Okay. All right, so this first slide kind of shows us our divisions of the nervous system. So the first thing to point out is our major divisions here of the central nervous system being our brain and spinal cord versus our peripheral nervous system being our cranial and spinal nerves, or basically everything outside of our brain and spinal cord. So that's our two main divisions. So the way this works in this loop is that we get sensory impulses or incoming information that's sent up to the brain. It's our brain's job to then interpret that information and decide what should happen by sending motor impulses or other information back out to the periphery. So we call this sensory information that is going into the brain, we call that afferent impulses. So afferent arrives. So afferent arrives to the brain. Afferent or sensory information also travels up ascending tracts. So it travels up to the brain. Our motor impulses are our outgoing information. We call that efferent information. So that's going to be our efferent exits is how we refer to that. So afferent arrives, efferent exits. And so if we look a little farther, we can break this down a bit further. We have a motor division and a sensory division. In our sensory division, we have the visceral and somatic sensory. So anytime you see the word visceral, you should know that's referring to an organ. So that's the sensation within our organ systems. And then our somatic sensory, soma, meaning the body. So that's going to be what we kind of think of as normal sensation, light touch, vibration, pressure, all that stuff that we feel on our skin. Within the motor division, again, we have a somatic division. So that's going to be our body or skeletal muscle division. Then we have the autonomic division. Autonomic sounds a lot like automatic. So that's kind of how you should think of it. It's what's going to do all of our involuntary control. And then within that autonomic division, we have our sympathetic division. So sympathetic, you want to think fight or flight. So it's our system that gets us geared up to go. So sympathetic pretty much amps everything up. Our parasympathetic division, on the other hand, is going to be our rest and digest portion. So this is the portion of our nervous system that is going to calm everything down. And the only thing that gets stimulated by the parasympathetic is it increases our digestion and it also increases our urinary system function. So this shows a cross section of a spinal cord here. And so this is what I was talking about in terms of ascending and descending tracts. So you see our green lines here are going to be carrying afferent or sensory information because they're traveling up to the brain, whereas our purple tracks are carrying descending information. Our descending tracks have our afferent or our motor. Sorry, beep, 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 rewind, back up. Green is on the ascending tract. It has our sensory information, which is our afferent information. Afferent arrives. Our purple lines are our descending tracts, so they're going to have our motor or efferent information. Efferent exits. So one thing to point out here is the difference between the white and gray matter. So our white matter in the spinal cord is on the outer portion. Our gray matter is on the inside. In the brain itself, we have gray matter on the outer portion and white matter on the inside. So our gray matter tends to be the cell bodies of our neurons, and the white matter typically is going to be the axons because it shows up white due to the myelin sheath or covering, but we'll talk about that a little bit more. Oh, sorry, guys. There we go. Okay. All right, so our neurons are our major cell of the nervous system. So this is the one that is primarily doing the job. So we're going to start on the left side here with our dendrites. So these are the branches, and so these are what are going to receive information. So when a nerve is signaling another nerve, this is where that nerve is going to receive the information. It's then going to process that within the cell body, which is also known as the soma, which contains the nucleus. So typically we have a lot of dendrites, always a one cell body, and then typically only one axon, which is this projection here. The axon is what sends information. That's where the nerve impulse is going to travel past. Each little yellow dot here is a Schwann cell forming the myelin sheath. You can think of the myelin sheath as an insulator to our nerve. So think just like a wire typically has a rubber coating. Our nerve cells that act like electrical wires in our body are insulated with myelin. And so this allows them to transmit impulses much more quickly and efficiently. In between each cell, we call that a node of Ranvier. And so at that area, the signal kind of jumps across each node to continue traveling down the axon. And eventually, when we get to the end of our axon, we have these little synaptic terminals, or our dots at the end here, and they contain neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are a way for our nervous system to communicate with one another, and they release chemicals, which typically have an effect of telling either the next nerve or muscle or structure to do more or continue what we call an excitatory neuron or neurotransmitter, or it's going to tell it to stop what it's doing and shut off, which would be an inhibitory neurotransmitter. The other cells that we're going to talk about is our glial cells. Sometimes you'll see these written as neuroglial cells or just glial cells, and these are our support cells. So our neurons themselves are conducting action potentials or those nerve impulses, and these other cells are here for support. So our first one is an astrocyte. It helps form the blood-brain barrier, which is a very important component of our brains that prevent certain substances from actually being able to enter the brain. So our brain is a very delicate environment, so we want to make sure that only the correct things are getting there. So astrocytes are there to maintain the blood-brain barrier and eliminate things that should not cross that threshold. Oligodendrocytes is our partner for our Schwann cell. So I don't think, yeah. So let me pop back a slide. So each little yellow one here is a Schwann cell. And so they form our myelin sheath in our peripheral nervous system. The oligodendrocyte, it's going to also deposit myelin on neurons or form that myelin sheath, but it's going to do that in our central nervous system rather than the peripheral one. Our microglia, they're the immune system of our nervous system, or the immune cell of our nervous system. And so their job is to identify dead cells or foreign cells and phagocytize them or engulf and destroy them. And then finally, we have our ependymal cell, and that's going to secrete our cerebrospinal fluid within our central nervous system. So our cerebrospinal fluid is the fluid that is circulated throughout the brain in spaces known as ventricles, and it's also circulated through our spinal cord and then kind of up and around back to the brain. All right, our first kind of practice here. So go ahead and take a look. Obviously, we have a lot of the same roots here, but go ahead and see if you can match up the suffix to figure out our different terms here. So neuralgia, that's going to be nerve pain. Neuritis, that's going to be inflammation of a nerve. Neurogenic is going to mean kind of being generated or generate kind of originating in our neuron or nervous system, neurogenic. Neurologist is someone who studies nerves. Neurolemma, our suffix lemma is for sheath or covering, and our neurolemma is kind of the outer portion of our nerve, or the covering of a nerve is the way you can think of it. Neurolysis, that's going to be lysis. Our suffix is to dissolve or destroy. So neurolysis is if we're having destruction of a nerve. This is actually part of our nerve cell healing process. Neuropathy, that is a term that just means kind of a disease process of our nervous system. Peripheral neuropathy is very common, especially in the diabetic population, which is a issue with their nerves due to the hardening of arteries and lack of blood flow. If you kind of want to look at that as an example, that would be peripheral neuropathy. Neuroplasty, our suffix plasty is surgical repair. Tomy, remember that one's going to be an incision versus neurectomy. Ectomy is going to be surgical removal. So neurotomy would be an incision in a nerve. Neurectomy would be removal of a nerve. A ganglioma, oma is a suffix we've seen a few times now. That's for tumor. And then our gangly slash O would be our combining form for ganglion. So ganglion is a group of nerve cells. So I'll kind of hit on that when we get a little farther along. Gliosis, glee is for glial, osis meaning abnormal. So this would be an abnormal condition of a glial cell. Radiculitis and rhizotomy, our two roots here are both referring to a nerve root. Itis meaning inflammation. So radiculitis would be inflammation of a nerve root. Rhizotomy would be an incision into a nerve root. So one thing I want to show on this diagram here, you see we have a posterior or a dorsal root and an anterior or a ventral root. So our spinal cord is over here to the left. This is our zoom in. So the anterior or ventral root is our motor pathway. So it's sending motor impulses out. Our dorsal root is our sensory pathway. It's bringing sensory information in. So posterior is only sensory, anterior is only motor. And then those end up merging together to create a spinal nerve. So our anterior and posterior roots blend into a spinal nerve. And so our spinal nerves do both sensory and motor information. It's not until the roots where we split them in half to just sensory or just motor. Here's a good joke for you guys. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the lobes of the brain, and then we're going to see if we can actually apply some of that information. So we have 4 lobes to the brain. Before I even get to the lobes, let me just point out we have these ridges on our brain, which we call gyri, and we have lines on the brain, which we call sulci. And so those are our ridges and our valleys. So gyri and sulci. And if we have a really deep sulcus, we call that a fissure. So you can't really see one in this picture, but I'll point one out later. So our frontal lobe is going to be the part of our brain that is responsible for all of our motor activity. This precentral gyrus is where our motor cortex is. So all of our motor activity is going to go through the frontal lobe. And we also do things in the frontal lobe, such as planning. Our personality is affected by the frontal lobe. Impulsivity is affected, but especially think anything motor related is going to go through the frontal lobe. The parietal lobe is our sensory center. So it's separated from the frontal lobe by our central sulcus. And then we have the post-central gyrus. This is going to be our sensory cortex. So any sensory information is going to pass through our parietal lobe. Our occipital lobe is most known for it being our vision center. So think about getting hit in the back of the head and seeing stars. That's part of the reason. And then our temporal lobe is going to do some other sensory information to help integrate with our parietal lobe. And it's also responsible for things like speech and language, not just reading and speaking, but truly understanding and comprehending what we're saying and hearing. So, based on what we just talked about briefly, take a look at these and see if you can figure out what area. And there's one or two that you could pick two different, and really there are two different regions that work together. And then besides knowing the lobe, kind of just keep in mind some of these things like your central sulcus, your lateral sulcus, and your parieto-occipital sulcus in terms of understanding how we know which lobe is where. Those are kind of our landmarks for separation. So number one, it's a decision making and planning. So that's going to be frontal lobe. Two and three both involve sensation. So we gave credit to both our parietal lobe and temporal lobe. Our parietal lobe is going to be the main driver of that, but our temporal lobe is going to help out. And then reading, in terms of actual vision, occipital lobe is going to do that. If you wanted to talk about understanding and of reading, you could give some credit to the temporal lobe again. Okay, this time we're going to go farther inside the brain. So our lobes are all a part of our cerebrum. And then our brain stem itself is here. It's made up of the pons, medulla oblongata, and the midbrain. So our brainstem contains a lot of our life centers, meaning stuff like our respiratory rate, our heart rate, our blood pressure control. All of that is controlled within the brainstem, and it also serves as an attachment point for a lot of our cranial nerves, which we'll talk about a little bit more. Above our brainstem, we have our diencephalon. That's our thalamus and hypothalamus. And so they're involved in a lot of our emotional responses with the limbic system, such as pain, anger, memory, all that stuff. That's kind of like that higher level abstract concepts happen within the diencephalon. It also controls our circadian rhythm in terms of kind of when we feel like we should be awake versus asleep. It controls hunger and thirst somewhat. Our hypothalamus actually contributes to secretions at the anterior pituitary. And so our hypothalamus more or less tells our pituitary gland, especially the anterior portion, kind of when to release its hormones. And then the last piece here is our cerebellum. Our cerebellum is sometimes known as the little brain because it kind of hides underneath our cerebrum and is in the back portion. So this is the posterior part of the brain. And its job is to coordinate our movement. So balance, equilibrium, all that stuff. And then that cerebrum, that's just kind of the main portion of our brain. Like I said, that was where we derived all those lobes from. One other thing to point out is that our brainstem and spinal cord are continuous with one another, so there's not actually a gap at all. This is where the brainstem would exit the foramen magnum out of the skull before we call it the spinal cord. Sorry, I didn't mean to click quite yet, so pause it if you don't want to cheat, but these match up with everything. So standing on one foot, our cerebellum is in charge of balance. Our brain stem, so tachypnea, remember that's going to be rapid breathing. So our respiratory center is contained there. Thirst is going to be our hypothalamus. So hunger and thirst is the hypothalamus specifically. And then number four sounds pretty painful, so it's going to go through our thalamus. Okay, some other nerves to point out. These are our cranial nerves. We have 12 pairs. And so some of our cranial nerves are sensory, some of them are motor, and some of them are mixed. That's the different colors that you see on this left-hand side. And so you guys do not need to memorize all of the cranial nerves and what they do, or whether the fact that they're sensory, motor, or mixed. Just know that we have 12 of them and that they all have different combinations in terms of what information they're responsible for. So we already talked about the different segments within the spinal cord, or not spinal cord, but vertebral column in our skeletal chapter. But we're going to talk about the nerves themselves. So each of our, um, oops, sorry guys. Each of our levels has its own nerve. So remember, we have seven cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, and 5 lumbar vertebrae. So our cervical spine is the only one that's the exception to the rule. It actually has 8 pairs of spinal nerves, one for each level of the vertebrae, and then one more that comes out just above, just below C7. Thoracic matches up, there's 12 pairs. Lumbar matches up, there's 5 pairs. And then sacrum, even though it's fused, it still has a nerve for each of its segments. All right, just a little bit more practice here. So go ahead and pause the video and see if you can go ahead and write a definition for all of our words and then start again when you're ready. This is just good practice. And then this is more just some nice to know information, nothing that's super relevant for direct to the test, but a few different tests that we use clinically to actually test out whether spinal nerves are functioning. So Romberg test, this more tests proprioception and balance. So this may point to some actual like up the chain, more like cerebellar, a cerebellum or balance problem or a cranial nerve problem. Motor tests is just going to test strength. So each level of our spinal nerve corresponds with specific muscles. So if we test certain muscles, certain ones are strong, certain ones are weak, it's going to give us a hint at which nerve level may be causing that weakness. And this last one is a 2-point discrimination test. So if you take 2 fingers and poke on 2 different parts of your arm or leg, if it's far enough apart, you should be able to tell that that was 2 different touches, even though they happen at the same time. Once they get really close together, that becomes much, much harder. So this kind of establishes how close together 2 points can be for you to still detect them as 2 points. And so there's kind of a standard value that if these 2 points are really wide and you still only feel it as one, you're likely not getting great sensory function. Just one other thing, this is kind of what I was talking about with our motor test in terms of the actions that each root is responsible for. So we can test the muscles that do these actions, and that gives us a hint to which root could be involved. On the left side, this is a dermatome map. So we call those myotomes. Remember, myo muscle. Derm or dermat is skin. So dermatomes are the map of sensation around the skin where different levels correspond to. So for example, if we're all the way up top, if you're rubbing on the back of your head, that area or the nerve that supplies that area traces back to your C2 nerve root, or vice versa. If I'm all the way and I'm kind of touching my shin, that nerve down in my shin that supplies my skin traces all the way back to the L5 root. So same idea, either areas of the skin where they're getting numbness or pain or muscle weakness can give us hints on what level that might trace back to, because it could be a problem in the spine, not necessarily a problem out in the periphery. All right, thanks for listening.